Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. Today, we're recording on a Tuesday, April 28, 2026, and we're here with a special guest today who I will introduce in a moment. I just want to say today's subject matter and conversation is going to look a little bit different. It's actually, I think, going to be somewhat of a breath of fresh air after quite a bit of conversation about Iran. Over the last few weeks, we get to take a step back and have a conversation about a broader topic, namely Christians and the Middle East, the persecution that they face, and how America should be addressing their persecution. So before we begin and jump right into that, I do want to introduce our special guest, Samuel Ben-Ur from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Samuel is a research analyst there focusing on Christian persecution. He also has, prior to joining FTD, spent some time interning at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, an organization called FIRE for short, focusing on free speech and expression, also an Israeli cybersecurity startup, and the American Enterprise Institute. He graduated from Tufts University with a BA in history and political science and has been spending quite a bit of time recently thinking about the subject, actually published an article recently in Providence magazine that we'll link in the show notes. So I'm very excited to have a very different conversation this week with Samuel. Welcome, Samuel, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Samuel, we're going to jump right into this. As I mentioned, you recently wrote an argument for Providence Magazine, which is a foreign policy journal that focuses on an audience interested in ideas broadly known as Christian realism. They've done a lot of really interesting work over the last several years, and your article focused on this argument essentially that U.S. foreign policy should protect Christians around the world. You focused on more than just the Middle East, but for the purposes of today's conversation, we'll really focus primarily on countries around the Middle East. I do want to come back to later in the conversation your argument about how we respond to this persecution, but also it feels like maybe we should lay some groundwork first. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm actually going to start with a very, very basic question. How would you sort of define persecution? Like what are we talking about exactly?
So if we're talking about persecution in the Middle East, first of all, I think it's important to say that even within the Middle East, no countries persecute religious minorities or Christians in the exact same way. There are often a variety of ethnic, religious, and authoritarian factors that play into these dynamics. So it's easy to sort of get into the thinking that because it's in the Middle East, it all comes from Islamic prejudice, but that's not entirely the case every single time. But the way that it plays out often looks the same. So Christian persecution, in essence, is the denial of the freedom of worship of Christians within a society. What that looks like on the ground differs from country to country. One common theme throughout many of the countries that we'll get into, including Iran. I know you said you didn't want to talk about Iran, but yeah, we'll get there in a different context at some point.
Sure. Yeah.
But apostasy laws and blasphemy laws are two of the biggest commonalities that you find across a lot of these societies. Many of them are governed by some form of Sharia law, whether that's Hanafi or Salafi Islam. They have different prescriptions and sentences for these crimes, but the main concern that you see, especially in the more authoritarian countries, are fears that Muslims will convert away from Islam and towards Christianity. That challenges their worldview in a way that we'll get into, but it also represents a threat to their power. If they can't control their population as a Muslim population, which is how many of them define themselves, Iran, Qatar, Afghanistan, Turkey increasingly so in recent years under Erdogan, then that represents a challenge to their legitimacy. So some of it comes from, and again, this differs, but some of this comes from a desire to keep what they define as Muslim countries Muslim, and others view it as a challenge to their power, and often both.
So that's really fascinating. Right out of the gate, I think you've opened up an interesting can of worms, this idea that persecution of Christians is not always a matter of religious conflict, and at times is more so a matter of political or strategic conflict for control of the state, something along those lines, which very interesting. That's an important nuance, I think, which maybe we can unpack a little bit more in a moment. You just rattled off a few countries that are, dangerous for Christians, or to varying degrees dangerous for Christians. Can you maybe break down a little bit some more specific examples of what makes some of these countries dangerous? What are the threats that Christians face in some of these countries? And feel free to include Iran, but I'm interested in, of course, in also an overview of what are some of the nuances throughout the region and as far as challenges that Christians face in different societies.
Yeah, so there are a few different types that these countries broadly fall into, and I think I'm not going to highlight every single country. I think there are about 6 or 7 that we look at within the bounds of our project, but
Mm,
there are a few interesting dynamics at play. So about Iran and Iraq, they have a somewhat unique tension where they have large ethnic Christian populations that are indigenous, or Iraq has the largest. It has about 10 million, or had about 10 million Chaldean Christians,
mhm,
Chaldean Catholic Christians, and Iran has a lot of Chaldean and Assyrian Christians of various denominations, mainly Orthodox. But when you're building a society, it's similar to the ones that the Iranians and Iraqis have tried to build, where you are a Muslim country, but you also have this long history of presiding over, substantial Christian populations, more so in Iraq. It's harder for you to call yourself the same name of this country that's, existed for, many years at least, you know, maybe not formally under the Ottoman Empire, but, has a long history, and you have to make certain allowances for it. So in Afghanistan, which doesn't have ethnic Christian population at all, every single Christian there is assumed to be a convert. And of course, as Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban, which is a terrorist group, brutal, evil, murderous regime, if you're found to be doing any Christian worship in Afghanistan, regardless of the context that you claim it's in, they'll, drag you out into the street and execute you. And as a result, there's
mm,
very few Christians in Afghanistan, maybe 10,000. But it gets less extreme, but still bad in Iran and Iraq, where they've made concessions because there is precedent in Islamic society for ruling over minority religious populations. They're called Jimmy. Jews are included in this, as well as Christians. But, so long as you are subservient and you pay a special tax called jizya, then you can live in these societies. So they have to sort of grapple with that tension where they want to be seen as a continuation of these, in the case of Iran, 1,000-year-old plus society. And political
right.
realities as well, which is, and this is in the case of Iran, that a ton of people in Iran are converting to Christianity because they're so disillusioned with the failings of the regime. So that's one dynamic. You also have countries like Egypt, and then this is also present in Iraq, where the government is weak. They don't have the ability to effectively combat terror groups. And if they did, the last place they would do it would be in defense of Christian minorities. So you see this play out mostly in Iraq with the popular military forces, where they control swaths of Iranian territory and they go around massacring Christians and other ethnic minorities as well. And the central government is too weak. In Egypt, they have a stronger government, but the problem there is, since Mohammed Morsi was ousted during the Arab Spring, there's been an undercurrent of anti-Christian sentiment within Egyptian society. And Egyptian has quite a few Coptic Christians, I think 15 million or so, one of the largest Christian groups in the Middle East. But they're sort of seen within Egyptian society as a pariah, maybe in a way that the government doesn't necessarily see them. So with a country like Egypt, the persecution stems from a failure to push back against public calls for violence, or blocking the construction of churches was a big issue for them in around 2016. And they don't have the democratic institutions or stability necessary to effectively address these concerns. A country like Egypt or Turkey, which we can talk about after, the US has a lot more room to work with because nominally we're allies with these countries. And so there have been cases in Egypt, especially, where there's a strict cybercrime law where if you're Christian and you're saying things that are deemed to be blasphemous under Egypt's code of laws, they can arrest you. This has happened a couple of times over the past few years, where one of these cases has become high profile and international pressure has gotten Egypt to either throw out the sentence or, not convict under their laws. So those are a
Hmm.
few different elements. Qatar is like completely different because they rely on a mostly international Christian workforce to come in and build all of their things. Qatari citizens are outnumbered largely by these foreign workers, and they're a couple million, I want to say. So they have to, because they invited them in, they have to make at least, they have to save face and be seen to be making an effort. But in reality, for the million foreign workers in Qatar who are Christian, there's one place in the country for them to worship. They have one religious center in Doha where there are a couple of churches within that center. And that's the only place they're allowed to worship. And in all of these places, besides maybe Egypt, but if you're found to be proselytizing and trying to convert people away from Islam to Christianity, that is a serious offense. As in some countries like Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, it can be punishable by death as well.
It's interesting that you continue to highlight the sort of ethnic diversity of and composition of many Christian groups in the Middle East. I think this is where we get to some of what you were arguing, that this is more than just a religious issue. In some cases, it's a way of trying to control or pacify, depending on your perspective, certain minority groups that pose a threat to the state's power. Is that why you find some states concerned more so with their own power than perhaps their religious obligations, because of the threat they pose as an ethnic group? Or what exactly is the nuance there, I suppose?
I would say it's about legitimacy more so than anything. In the cases of Iraq, Iran, and even Syria, the ethnic minorities that are primarily Christian aren't the most numerous or organized, especially. The organization part of it is powerful. But at a local level, it's similar with the Druze. I think that would be the Druze in Syria are probably the best example, where you saw earlier last year when the new government forces were going to, march on Druze villages near Sweda, and, Lebanese Druze and Israeli Druze just marched across their borders to go and support them. That's a sort of dynamic that these countries are aware of. But in the case of their own legitimacy, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic regime, is claiming to be a continuation of this society. Iranian society has always included these groups. If they cracked down on them more harshly than they have, and they definitely have cracked down on them, I'll just give one example, because I know, we shouldn't talk about Iran too much today. You're not allowed in Iran, any Christian group, to hold services in Farsi, which is that's the national language in Iran. And the reason for that is the regime fears that if Muslims could understand what Christians are saying, they would convert. So that's one example. But they have to make certain allowances in order to continue to say that they are like legitimate rulers of all members of their society. This is the case in Turkey as well, which used to have a much more substantial Christian population, but has since winnowed it down, mostly through bureaucratic means, as they've gone down the road of Islamicization.
Yeah. Well, I think just to come back to Iran actually for a moment, because there's something really interesting there. And there's some parallels there, I think, with Turkey, this challenge that they have with their Christian minorities. I think legitimacy is a good word to describe what you're getting at. I think just another catchphrase throughout there that has some meaning, as well as territorial integrity. One of the things that is so fascinating about some of these Christian minorities is they find themselves either in a position of seeking some sort of semi-autonomous governance or self-rule in a particular part of territory. In Iraq, referencing the Nineveh Plains and the Assyrian movement there, especially during the height of ISIS. Turkey, probably have a little bit less of that going on, but you have the Turks so concerned with the Kurdish problem that any sort of smaller ethnic group, no matter how small, is going to appear to be a threat, even if they don't actually pose one. Iran, you've got all kinds of issues there. You've got the Azeris, you've got the Assyrians, you have the Kurdish problem there as well. So there is, I think, a lot of really interesting dynamics at play here in terms of what contributes to the paranoia, frankly, about Christians. Even if they don't pose a threat to the state, they don't intend to, they may still cause or be subject to an overreaction by the state that manifests itself as some pretty intense persecution. There's a lot there that we could discuss as far as the why behind persecution and how it manifests itself. But your article was fascinating, and I want to maybe come back to that, because the crux of the article, I think, was actually an argument about response, not necessarily an overview of persecution. In your article, you noted that there are essentially two cases for protecting religious liberty. There is a moral case and there is a pragmatic or strategic case. I think you spent more time in the article on the pragmatic or strategic, so I'd appreciate it if maybe we could start by expounding a little bit on what is the moral case to protect religious liberty outside U.S. borders as you see it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I might talk about at some other point in this column I have in Providence. But it comes straight from America's founding, but we didn't, our enforcement of it, that's probably the wrong word. but the way we've gone about achieving religious freedom abroad has changed. So the original conception of it was the founders were very much committed to the ideas expressed in Locke's treatise on toleration. They believed that everyone had a right to choose their faith broadly. Madison, in Memorial and Remonstrance, framed it as a duty owed to God, which precedes civil authority. So it's a unalienable right as part of liberty. So that's the basic idea, but it didn't become a foreign policy issue for a long time, mostly because we were a young nation fighting many wars at home, including Civil War wars against the British. Yeah, I don't have to get into it, but this really became an international issue during the Cold War, actually. And this is something that I didn't talk about in my article, but easily could have. Reagan pioneered this method when he was combating the Soviet Union, and he didn't frame it around Christians. That's something new to Trump that no other president has done. But the idea of America going to war for ideas, right? Not a hot war, sometimes a hot war, but more broadly, the Cold War was about fighting communism, right? And its epicenter within the USSR. So that framing helped lay the groundwork for what would become an institutionalized, universal human rights set of laws that you should look at the International Religious Freedom Act that was, I believe, in 1998, which basically took Reagan's thinking on ideology and applied it to religion, and saying people should be free to choose their ideology and should not have it be forced on them, and people should be free to choose their religion. And this is now a priority for the United States. That's based on moral reasons. Basically the same thing that Madison argued, which is that this is a universal human right. And if Americans are to be good stewards of the world and a positive force for good, this is a thing that we must protect abroad. Otherwise, it would be inconsistent. And that differs from the original version, which is we'll be a city on the hill and people will naturally want to copy us, which is how we'd sort of thought about it in the past.
So that's fascinating. I think one of the points I do remember from your article is this concept that there is even within Locke's ideology, there's a Judeo-Christian framework that is derived from, really it's biblical principles. The idea that there is inherent human dignity within each one of us because of our representation of the creator, or the image of the creator. That's a very Judeo-Christian principle drawn from scripture that was then expounded upon by political philosophy. So I get that. I think one of the things that was really interesting, what you just said, though, referencing this Cold War historical example, is it seems like the line gets blurry very quickly between the moral case and the strategic case. You're arguing that the fight against communism was a moral cause or a moral reason why we adopted certain U.S. foreign policy principles, beginning with the Reagan administration. But I think if you look at the history of the Cold War, you could just as easily make an argument that the fight against communism was a pragmatic one, that there were a variety of other strategic reasons why the United States felt like it needed to adopt a policy, most of the Cold War, of containment, essentially, not allowing communism to spread within certain spheres of influence. So I guess my question for you in follow-up to what you just said is, where do you draw the line between the two, I suppose? I mean, is there a difference between the two? Are they essentially the same, both moral and strategic case?
Reagan blurred the line intentionally, but the moral case for the Cold War had more to do with his framing than how he accomplished. But there are cases where the two did actively bleed into each other. In Poland, under communist rule, Reagan coordinated quite closely with Pope John Paul II at that time to fight for the rights of the Polish Solidarity movement to express opposition. And Poland was a deeply Catholic country. So they were able to coordinate on this, and it was one of the many factors that led to the liberation of Poland. But the idea that I'm trying to express is not that Reagan used this moral language as a tool of political power, but this is how he framed it. And the framing is important because that is part of how he made the case for the Cold War and was able to sell sort of this idea and his policy to Americans. I think the Trump administration is trying to do something similar. There are many strategic reasons that you can ascribe to the actions that they've taken to prevent the persecution of Christians. So I see a lot of similarities there where this is a perfectly true and just moral reason to do things that are in America's interests as well, right? So you can secure both. It's a bit like having your cake and eating it too. Reagan was able to bridge that gap. We'll see if the Trump administration is able to also.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Not necessarily a clear break between the two. That there's obviously quite a bit of overlap between the moral and strategic considerations. One of the things that you did in the article, I think, was push the envelope in some interesting ways by making the argument that there is not just a case to protect religious liberty generally, but specifically Christian religious liberty, or to defend Christians specifically against persecution. So I'm curious to hear, maybe, I mean, you did touch on this in the article, but if you wouldn't mind explaining here as well, how do we get to a point in the argument where there's reason to focus on Christian persecution specifically, perhaps even more so, at least it's implied in the article, more so than other forms of persecution?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were just discussing about the blurring between strategic and moral lines. But what I was arguing in the piece is essentially there's a strategic element to protecting Christianity globally that America should focus on, both because we have the blueprint for what I'm about to describe here, and also because we can see that it's reproducible if we go back to the common ideas. But the thesis of the argument is American democracy developed out of the Judeo-Christian principle that man was made in God's image. Locke took that idea to mean, Locke took that idea to, or he derived the idea of consent of the governed from that idea, arguing that because man was made in God's image, no man has a natural right to authority over another. And because of that, the only way for man to participate in society is to do so with their own consent. This idea seems basic to us. It really does. It's baked into the 250 years, almost to the day of our country's history. But this is not something that is commonly accepted across the authoritarian world. In fact, it's still radical to them. And it's why I argue that we talked about the Middle East, but in countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Nicaragua, you see Christians being persecuted for non-religious reasons because they fear that because America grew out of this idea that if they allow Christianity to spread and have freedom of worship, then it's possibly reproducible. And I think they're right, which is why I argue that Christianity should have a focus in America's strategy, not just our religious freedom, which comes from a moral place, although we should not by any means reduce that or stop doing that. That has its own cause. This would be in addition to what we're doing. There should be, I think, a special focus on Christianity, at least as the Trump administration has framed it. Right? Because I'll just go into it a little bit more. China would be the best example of this. One of their most common tactics or their ethos in how to persecute Christians is by changing Christian worship through the use of these organizations that they have, basically saying you can practice Christianity legally, but if you're in the Three Self-Patriotic movement for Protestants or the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which is for Catholics, if you join the CCPA, which is the Catholic one, you have to denounce all ties to the Vatican, which, strikes right at the heart of Catholic faith. And if you're a Protestant, you have to, and Catholics have to do this also, but you have to include Xi Jinping thought in your sermons. You're not allowed, or you're very much discouraged from saying that any force is above the party, including God. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to steer Christian worship away from God and from Jesus and towards the party. And that's how they see it. They're trying to redirect this force into something that works for them because they can't control it. They can't control people in the same way that they can through fear when they believe in a higher power. Right. And that's why Christianity and this Judeo-Christian belief is so at odds with basically every authoritarian power across the world, because if they don't consent to be governed and believe they have a right to that consent, then that undermines the legitimacy of the regime.
I think it's so interesting. We're kind of circling back to where we started this conversation. One of the reasons why Christian persecution exists in many of these states is because it represents not just a religious threat to a religious regime. In some cases, it's really much less about that, more so that it represents a political threat of some kind to their legitimacy or the political ideology of the regime. And one of the things that stands out to me as I'm listening to you describe this, and as we come back to this point, it seems like those who would aid in the defense of Christians against these authoritarian regimes are probably going to enjoy some strategic benefits, in the sense that you are really weakening the foundation of these authoritarian regimes, which are rivals or opponents of the U.S. So there are some grand strategic benefits to be gained from doing so. At the same time, it also seems kind of like, just to play devil's advocate, it would be engaging in or promoting really a self-fulfilling prophecy that the regimes fear the Christians and the threat that they pose to their legitimacy, their standing, and that if the United States, for example, were to protect these Christians or come to their defense, then they would essentially be helping the Christians to do just that which the regime fears, which may in turn eventually endanger Christians. So you did highlight this briefly at the end of your article, the fact that there are some potential risks if we get this quote unquote wrong. If you come to the aid of Christians and don't calibrate carefully how you do so, it could backfire. And I'm curious to maybe close on that note. Realistically, what can/should the United States be doing to protect Christians? And how do we ensure that it doesn't backfire on us and actually wind up creating second, third order consequences that could potentially be very painful?
Absolutely. It's an important distinction that I'm going to hopefully draw out more in future pieces. But the basic idea is that, and this is an important thing across, I said earlier in the podcast that you can't, no country persecutes Christians the same way. Basically, every single country that I've described, including the ones outside of the Middle East, say the same things about Christians publicly, which is that they're fifth columnists intent on shattering society, and they're agents in the Middle East, they're agents of Zionism and the US, and the rest of the world, they're agents of the US. So they already have this framing baked in. It's almost never true. There have been a few cases where maybe they could have made the argument that this was accurate, but most of the time it's the default response that they use because they see this connection and can make this argument to justify it to the population that is not Christian within their societies. Doesn't always work because it's often not true. But because of that, because they have this framework baked in, if our policy as the US is to go to Iran, coordinate with a bunch of Assyrian Christians and say, we want you to go out and convert Iranians, right? 5,000 Iranian Muslims from your church because we think this will destabilize the regime. If we do that, we'd be putting them in more danger than they're already in. And that wouldn't be productive. And it would also, I think this is so important, it would undermine their position within society. Because most, in basically every single case today, they're persecuted unjustly. They aren't attacking the regime. They're worshiping their faith the way that they see fit and have no larger strategic designs. However, we do. And in order to bridge that gap, there needs to be a separation between how US policy addresses this and how Christian worship on the ground plays. In fact, there should be a total divide between that. One of the benefits of working at a think tank is that we focus on policy, mostly government to government policy. That's the level to address this at. Right. We should be treating this, at least from from my perspective, the way we should be treating this is as a foreign policy goal. And how we achieve foreign policy goals has defined parameters, which is sanctions, which I've advocated for on certain branches of the Chinese repression apparatus. So tying actual geopolitical consequences to religious freedom, I think, is a good way to go about this, because we're not coordinating with them. We're not telling them how to worship. We're not actively trying to undermine the regime, but we're trying to promote the natural development of Christianity. And, just for the record, I'm Jewish. And the reason I don't say this about Judaism is because we don't proselytize. So it doesn't have the same sort of growth potential that Christian does. In fact, a common thing you see, especially in China and Iran, are explosive growths in Christian populations as people become disillusioned with the regime and seek something else to find meaning in their life. So it's something that, if left to its own devices without interference from the Chinese, Iranian, Russian, North Korean government, will naturally proliferate. It's unclear. You can't really put a timeline on it. It's a very long-term strategic goal, but just securing basic religious freedom for everybody in the country is the way that the US should be going about this, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm happy to hear that you're going to keep writing on this, because I think there's just so much more that we could be discussing, and unfortunately we don't have the time today to pull on every string that I would love to. Well, maybe I have to have you back at some point so we can unpack future articles as you write more on this subject. But thank you for your time and sharing with us today, which you could. I think for the listeners who have been tuning in today, a couple of big takeaways from everything that you just heard Samuel share. Number one, that this is a very complex topic. If that's not clear at the end of this conversation, I'm not sure if you were listening, because it's been a very complicated conversation, but it's important to, I think, try to be as educated as possible when speaking to topics that are is complex. Also, of course, very important to be praying, of course, for the safety of Christians in the region, but also for leaders who have to make some pretty tough choices at times about how to handle these very meaty foreign policy discussions. So thank you again, Samuel, for joining us. Do hope that we'll have a chance to have you back at some point. Thank you to Lindsay for producing this episode, for everyone who tuned in and listened. Hope you enjoyed this, and we will see you all again next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the